You are not what you eat, but what you digest and what your intestinal bacteria do with it. Many believe that the brains control the body, but the real command center may be the intestines. They control your immune system, hormones, and even your mood. Although we do our best for our health, we unconsciously damage them by destroying the delicate ecosystem in our intestines with the food we eat. Hello, health champions! Today we discuss the importance of our intestines and the 10 worst foods they destroy. The countdown is in random order. Number 10 is processed meat, and those are things like hot dogs, bacon, and sausages. One of the big problems is that they contain nitrates and nitrites that can bind to proteins and turn into nitrosamines, which is carcinogenic. And it's not because of the nitrates and nitrites themselves. It is the fact that they can combine under high temperatures and in acidic conditions and can form these nitrosamines. So whether you have very, very strong gastric acid, which you need to break down protein-rich food, or the worst thing is if you prepare them at a very high temperature, then you can form these cancer-causing substances. The way to avoid this is to prepare them at a lower temperature. One of the worst things is, for example, frying bacon, throwing it in a pan with very, very hot oil. That's not a good idea. If you prepare it slowly, you develop less of these bad substances. Many have heard of this but do not realize that this is not unique to processed meat. Even plant-based food contains nitrates and nitrites and also protein, so they can form nitrosamines but much less. And they also contain other substances. Plants contain antioxidants, polyphenols, and substances that compensate for this effect. So if you eat processed meat or cook it at a high temperature, it is a good idea to make it part of a larger meal with healthy nutrients and antioxidants. And preparing food at a very high temperature can also produce heterocyclic amines or polycyclic aromatic carbohydrates. A whole mouthful, but it means that these are chemicals that seriously irritate or damage the intestinal wall. And that's what we're trying to protect. Another problem with this processed meat is that it often contains other ingredients of low quality. They can contain MSG, chemicals, preservatives, fillers, or sugar. So be very selective. Processed meat is not necessarily bad if it is processed in a high-quality way. But we really have to understand how crucial the intestines are. And we're just hitting the top of the iceberg on this subject. So it's not about intestinal complaints. Many people know, if my intestines are flat, I feel very bad. We understand that. But it goes much further than symptoms, and we also know that the intestines regulate the digestion and absorption. It is very important because everything we put in it has to end up in the body, and the intestines take care of that. But it goes much further. So you have hardware, the tube. You can make enzymes, break things down, but the ecosystem, the biome, the billions of bacteria that live there, digest what you can't and make a lot of nutrients available to you. For example, few people realize that your intestinal bacteria make vitamins for you, such as B1, B2, B6, B12, and K2. If you have healthy intestines, they make them for you, and in many other ways. If you have healthy intestines, they can activate the nutrients. They pack them for you again. They process them into something that becomes a usable form. You may eat the right food, but without good intestinal bacteria, you can't use those nutrients. Another crucial point is that 70% of your immune system lives in your intestines. It's called gallbladder, intestinal-associated lymphatic tissue. The majority of your blood cells, white blood cells, immune cells, live there. If you imagine the inside of your intestines microscopically, the gallbladder has to enlarge the absorption surface. There are different layers with enzymes and other things in these little holes. But here it's like the basal membrane. And this is where most of your immune system lives, a very important part of your defense. As I said, the vast majority of your immune cells in the body lives there. And why is that? Because everything you put in your mouth, what you swallow, what ends up in this tube, is a bodily foreign substance. It's supposed to be part of the body, but it's not yet. It has to be screened, tested, and controlled. And that's why you have this immune system here. So, if something happens that's not intended, you get white blood cells, the gallbladder, the first monster, and they can process it very quickly and react to it. And then, of course, there are intestinal bacteria on the other side of you. And there will be a lot of these bacteria in the gallbladder, and also a lot of them outside, in the lumen, in the defecation. And when there is a good balance of all these bacteria, if you have healthy bacteria, then these bacteria train the immune system to behave correctly, to function calmly and efficiently. In this way, we create a state of harmony. But if on the other hand we get a lot of pathogenic bacteria, if we get dysbiosis, which results in an imbalance and an overgrowth of the bad bacteria, then we create a situation of chaos, because this immune system then constantly reacts and even overreacts to everything that happens in the lumen of the intestines. And the more chaos we have, the more infections and the more allergies and sensitivities we get. And another huge part of your well-being and health is the fact that 90% of the bad serotonin in the intestines is created, and that's your feel-good neurotransmitter. So a large part of your mood, of how you feel, is actually determined by the amount of balance that you have in your intestinal flora. This intestinal area is often called your second brain because of the many nerve tissue, the enteric nerve system, and so you have your enteric immune system. You have your intestinal microbiome. And in a sense, you can sometimes say that this second brain actually controls the first brain because the first brain reacts. It's two-way traffic. And depending on what happens down here, the first brain, your mood, your consciousness, will strongly depend on and react to what happens down there. So you can also see it as the fact that you share your brain with your animals. And interestingly enough, it's like you have two separate systems. One is enclosed in a separate compartment in your intestines and contains about as many bacteria, about 40 billion, as you have cells in your body, and it's like his own little ecosystem, his own little universe that produces chemicals, that processes things and sends signals to your brain and body. Nutrient 9, which destroys your intestines, is lean pasteurized saliva in all forms. A reason is that it contains A1 beta-casein. That's a protein that most people don't tolerate. It can turn into something called beta-casomorphine 7, which drastically increases the risk of food reactions, inflammations, and a leaky intestine. And the reason lean pasteurized saliva is worse than full pasteurized saliva is that when we remove the fat, we remove something that could compensate for the irritation. So we increase the ratio of A1 to fat. We remove about 90% of the fat that functioned as a buffer, and now there is less buffer. So there is more of the milk that this irritating protein is. But it can also get to the tissues much faster to irritate them. Now it's like this with pasteurization. Many people have trouble digesting pure milk. There are many sensitivities and lactose intolerances. But nature did not completely crush it when it made milk. It is the primary food for all mammals. In fact, when we pasteurize it, we destroy a lot of things that come from nature in the milk. So in raw, full, fresh milk, like in mother's milk, there is lipase and lactase. These are enzymes, these are living things that help us to dissolve fat and break down lactose. And milk also contains something called phosphatase. That is an enzyme that is needed to absorb calcium and phosphorus. You've probably seen the ads where they say milk is good for you. And they refer to the fact that if you drink a lot of milk, you get strong bones. What they forgot to tell is that if you pasteurize the milk, you destroy the phosphatase, and you can only absorb a fraction of the calcium and phosphorus that will actually form the bone. And then pasteurization also destroys the prothesis, the protein, to break down protein that would help us to break down this A1 casein. In addition, pasteurization destroys all probiotics, the lactobacillus and the bifidobacteria, and all the stuff that would actually help to support healthy intestines, a healthy intestinal flora, if we didn't pasteurize it. So raw milk is a kind of health product. If you don't pasteurize and give raw milk to people with an alcohol allergy, about 95% would be fine. Even with an alcohol allergy and lactose intolerance. There will still be people with extreme sensitivities who do not tolerate it. Another problem is that in most states it is illegal to distribute and sell raw milk, which is a shame. They sometimes distribute and sell it as milk for pets. If you can afford it, you can get something for your pet. What you are looking for is full milk. They never remove the fat, so it is full milk. And you want it raw. And if you prefer, you want something from a cow that is called an A2 cow. And it doesn't matter. There are two types of this casein protein. So there is A1 and there is A2. And some cows only make A1, some a mixture. And some cows only make A2, which this beta-casomorphine 7 does not create. That is the irritating substance. So it does not guarantee that you will tolerate pure milk completely. But it would drastically increase the chances of a better tolerance. And if there is still some left after your pet has had his share, then maybe there is still a little for you. Food 8 are healthy processed foods that can destroy your intestines. Think of muesli repen with tons of sugar and grain. Yogurt drinks full of sugar, stabilizers, emulsifiers and flavors, and also seeds and grain milk. Pure alternatives such as oats, soy and almond milk. The list goes on. They may not be too bad, but see what they put in it, because they are often put on the market as healthy. Millions of dollars are invested to make you think, hey, this is a healthier alternative. But they are often full of sugar, seed oils and emulsifiers to improve consistency and stability. We will discuss these three later in the video. Often plant-based is used as a trigger word, which makes people immediately think that it is healthy as long as it is plant-based. I am not for or against plant-based. There are all kinds of good foods. But know that they are often supplemented with glyphosate and other pesticides. And then they are processed with chemicals. All things that harm your intestines. And the worst thing about this category is that most people think they are healthy. They think, oh, let me take something very healthy for myself. Let me really take care of myself. And then you take something that doesn't really help. Number 7 are emulsifiers and additives, such as polysorbate 80, carrageen, xanthan gum. And some of these are more synthetic and others more natural. The problem is that they are emulsifiers. They act as an intermediary between water and fat. And that is their goal in food, so they stabilize food. But because of these properties, they also disrupt fat layers, membranes and things in the body. So there is a protective layer in your intestines that acts as a barrier next to the cell membrane. So you have the cell membrane, and on the outside of it, there is a slime layer, which is like a slimy thing that is constantly being renewed, which protects this cell layer against the substances in the intestine. And many of these things we eat that destroy the intestines do that by disrupting that protective slime layer. And polysorbate 80 is one of those things that weakens this slime layer. And that is a kind of coating. And because of that, the bacteria can get much closer to the cell membrane. And if there are holes or a leaking intestine, these bacteria can cross these barriers. And what happens is that they trigger the immune cells and infections. And if we then look at carrageen, which is something so-called natural, well, that doesn't make it much better. Because it can also disrupt this slime, but it also triggers bacteria. So now your immune system, and then we're talking about all those immune cells in the gallbladder system, this carrageen, which triggers bacteria so strongly in view of a real and dangerous infection, and it will trigger a complete immune response and a strong inflammation reaction, with all possible consequences of that. Number 6 is alcohol. And alcohol is a solvent. We use it as a solvent. So it causes all kinds of damage to the intestines. It directly damages the enterocytes, the surface layer in your intestines. But it also disrupts. It reduces the production of mucin, or slime. So that protective layer we were talking about becomes weaker. And one of the things that happens, not just with alcohol, is that when this slime layer becomes thinner, more endotoxins start to leak. Especially something called LPS, lipopolysaccharide. An endotoxin is a toxin that is produced from within. It is produced by your pathogenic bacteria. If there are too many of those bad guys, there is no one to keep them in check. And these endotoxins become more numerous and start to leak. And that is a big problem. This causes inflammation, but is also very, very influential for our mood. They did a study where they injected people with this LPS, lipopolysaccharide, a very small injection, straight into the bloodstream. This is how they surrounded the protective mechanism we are talking about. Within a few minutes, every injected clinical sign of depression was shown. That is another indication of how important intestinal health is for our overall health. It's not just about food deprivation, but about our well-being and our mood. Remember that we share this brain with the ecosystem in our intestines. Food number 5 that destroys our intestines is gluten, which we mainly, but not exclusively, find in modern grains. There is a huge amount of gluten in it, and it contains something called gliadin, which influences a protein called zonulin, which causes a leaking intestine. And even though there are many grains that contain gluten, hybridized wheat, the modern form that is sold everywhere, can contain up to 50 times more gluten than old grain types such as rye, spelt, or barley. They all contain a little bit, but not as much as modern wheat. And what you also have to understand about gluten is that it is not a single thing. There are tens or even hundreds of types of gluten, and they all have different epitopes, small handfuls, that your immune system grabs and identifies. And they all look different, and it's not like your immune system recognizes the whole gluten molecule. It only recognizes one of those small attachments, and that's why there can be cross reactions. So you can eat corn, and corn can have one such small epitope. And as soon as your immune system is activated, the corn attracts attention and thinks it's gluten. Or even worse, there can even be a gluten cross-reaction with your own cells if it really gets heated up and becomes overactive. Then you can develop autoimmunity. So this gluten reaction starts to attract your own cells. And the extreme version, the strongest version of it, is called celiac. And those are people who actually start to bleed if they take even one bite of something with gluten in it. But we have to understand that these are very, very many preventive reactions, even if they are not as extreme as celiac. Number 4 are artificial sweeteners. And there are mainly 3 of them, which are aspartame, sucralose, and acesulfame K. And what these all mean is that they disrupt and damage the good bacteria. And when you reduce the good bacteria, you reduce the competition for the bad rice. And the most important ones that get damaged are called lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. And those are also the ones you find in raw milk, but which are present in pasteurized milk. But as part of this process, there is also a group, bacterial species, not individual tribes, but groups that firmicute, and called bacteroidetes. And they have to stay in a certain relationship. And if we distort that relationship too much, we change the metabolic signaling in the body. We see that as soon as we have increased the relationship between firmicutes and bacteroidetes, there is an increase in obesity and insulin resistance. So it is really ironic, very sad, that people started using these artificial sweeteners to get rid of sugar and to lose weight. And now they're disrupting their bacterial balance. So they're actually making it worse. They get fewer calories in, they have fewer sugar peaks by avoiding sugar. But in exchange for that, they change their metabolic signaling and compensate that surplus by eating other things. And one is perhaps even more problematic than the other. That is aspartame, because it is broken down into something called phenylalanine. And some people can't process that well. They have phenylketonuria, and that's why there are warnings about everything with aspartame. But what it does is, it creates an imbalance in the body, where we reduce the amount of the neurotransmitter serotonin, the happiness neurotransmitter. As a result, mood swings, craving, and appetite disorders arise. So stay away from artificial sweeteners, especially these 3. I can't emphasize enough how bad they are. This is just what they do to the intestines. So I think you're starting to see how important the intestines and the microbiome are. But where does it all start? Well, the very first start is when we are born. When we leave the birth canal, we get the most important meal of our lives, because we actually swim through a culture, a vaginal culture that becomes the first bacteria we have. And nowadays, so many children are born with an imperial cut, and we use disinfectants and alcohol, and we wash everything clean. So the children, even when they are born vaginally, a lot of that first meal is taken away. But from that moment on, the mother gives you the bacteria while you grow up. There are some in breast milk and on her skin and so on. But here's the problem. There is such a widespread use of antibiotics, pesticides, chemicals, junk food, all those things we're talking about in this video, make sure that your mother's biome, your mother's bacterial diversity is affected. It gets worse and worse, so your mother has less to give you. And because those antibiotics, because this process is inherited, is passed on, every generation gets a little worse as we use more antibiotics and pesticides. And the worse someone gets, the less he has to give to the next generation. So your mother had less than her mother, who had less than her mother, and so on. And at this point we are about 5 generations. Furthermore, with antibiotics, chemicals, and junk food. And it turns out that you also inherit your DNA and your epigenetics, the expression of your DNA. And that works a bit in the same way that by a bad lifestyle and by disrupting the environment, food shortages and stress, every generation gets a little worse in terms of the passed on DNA. So, there is a reason that we see this incredible increase of autism, allergies, ADHD, and so on. But it's not one thing. There are many different things. Yes, I don't think we should get 79 vaccines injected in our first years of life. I'm not against the idea of vaccines. I'm sure there is a suitable place for it somewhere. But the way in which we use it excessively. And by the way, if you inject someone with a vaccine, you surround the gallbladder, the intestinal-associated lymphoid tissue. That should demonstrate everything and build up an immune system based on what the body receives. But with vaccines, you surround that. So that's one part. In addition to what we were talking about, the intestinal biome, the DNA, and the food status. So we have to understand that. It's never one thing. But there are many things. We are so far removed from nature. But we have to understand it. We have to learn about our body so that we can turn the tide. And that's why I'm making these videos that are a little longer than 5 minutes. Because you don't learn from just a little bit of information. Food 3 are seed oils. Processed plant-based oils from cabbage, soy, corn, sunflower, safflower. The biggest problem with these oils is how they are made. In production, they are processed with high heat and pressure, and even chemical solvents, such as acetone, to extract the last oil from grain or seed. So that means that the oil that looks so clear and is so tasteless and doesn't even change on the shelf after years is already bad when you buy it. It is already damaged and destroyed. But in addition, it contains a lot of omega-6 fatty acids. So it shifts the omega-6 to omega-3. Composition in the body, which acts as a signal mechanism. It makes your body more inflammatory. It shifts that natural balance, but also because it is so rich in omega-6 fatty acids, and omega-6 is multiply unsaturated in 2 places unsaturated. That means they are very sensitive. They are sensitive to heat, but also to light and oxygen. So when something oxidizes very easily, it contributes more to oxidative stress. It creates more free radicals and contributes to that oxidation. But it also contributes to something called lipid peroxide, and that is like a corrosive molecule that just grabs things while they fly around, and it will damage the intestinal wall a lot. And number 2 is fried food. And we discussed many of the reasons to avoid that on the previous dia. We talked about the omega-6 and how it is already damaged. But when you fry food, you overheat it, and you keep it, as it were, boiling and exposed to oxygen. So it will contain a lot of oxidized oils and ages, advanced glycation, and products. And all of this is actually corrosive. It is very harmful to the intestinal microfilia that I drew for you. And it annoys. The imbalance in gallic acids. There is a certain type of fat and cholesterol that the body uses to make gall. And if we get a lot of these damaged oils in, we reduce the quality of the gall and increase it. The stress on the gallbladder. In addition, most fried food is covered with flour, so you get that crispy layer. And flour is of course modern wheat, which contains the gliadin that causes all these immune reactions. And food number 1 that damages your intestines is sugar and processed food, processed carbohydrates and starch. And it's not necessarily worse than all those other things we were talking about. But it's so superfluous, so all-encompassing. It's everywhere. In most Western countries, processed foods and the white rubble, white sugar, White flour and seed oils account for 50 to 60% of all the food we eat, all the calories. There are bacteria, usually pathogenic, which means they are bad. They are addicted to sugar, to simple sugars, and all these processed foods are quickly broken down into simple sugars, the monosaccharides and the disaccharides. So you selectively feed these pathogens, these sugar-loving bacteria, and you feed yeast that is addicted to sugar and some of these bacteria. Some examples are Candida, which causes an overgrowth of yeast, Candida albicans, and also Clostridium difficile, C. diff. But this food naturally causes metabolic problems. They cause insulin resistance, which leads to a low-degree chronic inflammation, which increases intestinal permeability or a leaking intestine. Because we drive up blood sugar, blood glucose, we increase the advanced glycation. End products: corrosive, harmful, chemicals that cause tissue damage. Sugar also drives fermentation. With yeast, fermentation, and sugar, you have a small brewery. In your intestines, you constantly drive inflammation and decay. If you liked this video, you will also find it great. If you really want to master your health by understanding how the body works, then subscribe, click on the bell, and turn on notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.